I'd like to just recap a little bit, and then just quite quickly, really, and then hopefully catch up with today's message to the Church of Sardis, which is a rather interesting message or description situation that we are presented with today. So if you remember, John is in Patmos. He is receiving a revelation that is, we're just looking into chapters 2 and 3, but the revelation he is receiving has to do with the entire 22 chapters of the revelation of John the Apostle. He is exiled in Patmos, and he receives messages. Well, it's one single message, as we have been trying to always remember, is one single message that eventually would have gone to the 7 churches that we see in the map. He would have taken probably a journey that it was a natural, normal journey that someone would do, and visit the 7 churches and give that message. So it's one single message with 7 different emphases that talk to 7 different people, if you like, of 7 different churches. And then there are similarities, as we are saying. There's one single message. There is a common imagery that is used. We need to think about Jesus as the high priest that walks among the lampstands, the lampstands that represent each of the churches. And then he talks about an angel, the angel, or the idea of the angel being the messenger. And this angel receives a message, and this message goes to each church. If you like, Jesus is speaking in John's revelation. He sees Jesus, and Jesus delivers this message to John, and John is seeing all this imagery that resembles some of the imagery that he would have been familiar with as a Jew and from the Old Testament. And so we come on to Sardis. Sardis, a church or a town, to start thinking about the town, with a great history. From the 7 towns with the 7 churches, this is the town that seems to have had sort of the most glorious history in the past. It is also a commercially active and very wealthy town. This is in a valley. So Sardis stands at the top of the valley, looking at the valley. 5, 6 different roads from antiquity, trade roads, kind of go through the city, and they can do a lot of commerce, they can do a lot of trading. There's a lot going on in there. But most of all is, it was once the capital of the Lydian kingdom. And this is important. Is very important in today's message, because there is a relation between the message and their history. And I think John is passing on a message that Jesus is expressing to this church, the Church of Sardis, that it just really taps into their own personality, their own who they are and what they are, and into their own history, because inevitably this history has affected them and keeps on affecting them through time. And I wonder whether we may have some sort of small moment along this morning, the next 20 or 25 minutes, where we might even have a reflection upon our own upbringing, our own culture, our own background and roots, and how that actually can affect the way we live our faith or do virtually everything in life. So you've got 2 pictures in here. The top picture, it's what would have been. This is a reconstruction of what the city might have looked like. And the bottom is actually the present ruins in Turkey. And the ruins that we see below is the top of the reconstruction. So it's like, that is the top of that hill. If you see, there is this wall that comes to the right and to the left, and it would have been a wall that came in a way that it made like a three-side valley that came from the hill and downwards. And so the city was protected by a steep hill or mountain that in some places is rather difficult to climb. And there was a wall placed on top, and the city was protected naturally from, if you like, from behind and from two sides. And they were on an attack, they would have been prepared to just defend the front, or looking down into kind of a bridge that looked, a natural bridge that looked into the valley, so they could very easily have seen their enemy coming. And so this is important, because we will be coming back onto this. And what is Jesus? As we have been in all the messages, Jesus reveals something about himself. He is, well, let's read the passage, having described a little bit of the city and what the city looks like. And I have a little video that I found that very helpful to look into the area, and that tells us a little bit more about the history that I will put to you once we read. It's only 6 verses, and it says like this. Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. To the angel of the church in Sardis write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up, strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard, hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me, dressed in white, for they are worthy. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Yet again, the plural there at the end, emphasizing that the message is for the 7 churches. So Jesus is him who holds the fullness of God. That is the expression. That's what the expression, the 7 spirits of God mean. We read in Colossians 1:19, the following, it says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. So that idea, the 7 spirits of God, is the whole of God, the whole of who God is and represents, resides in Jesus himself. This is the person that is speaking. And he's speaking to the 7 stars, to the 7 angels, to the 7 messengers that are being held tight in his hand. As we see the description at the beginning of chapter 2, but it's also along the lines of the description that Jesus gives of himself in chapter 1 of Revelations. So that's the person that he's speaking. That is the Jesus that he's speaking, that we must understand. He puts on this, if you like, this description on himself as he clothes himself and gets ready to deliver his message. It could be a praise, it could be an accusation. In Sardis' case, this is one of the churches that is in dire straits. This is one of the churches that is on the edge of judgment, and he then tells us why. But before we go in that, let's just extend a little bit more this understanding about what Sardis is, where it is, and a little bit of its history. And I think it's just interesting to have a real look of what this looks like today in Turkey. I hope you can hear the audio just fine.
The late afternoon sun, it's difficult to imagine that these bucolic fields around the small Turkish village of Sart ever looked any different than they do today. More than 2,000 years ago, however, Sart was called Sardis, and these were not farmers' fields, but the bustling capital city of the powerful kingdom of Lydia. Thanks to the collaborative efforts of the Harvard Art Museums, Cornell University, and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism, our international team of archaeologists has been working for over 60 years to uncover Sardis's complex 4,000-year history. A lot of our work involves digging, but digging alone isn't enough. It would take us as many centuries to completely excavate the site as it took Mother Nature to bury it. So we're always looking for new tools to help us interpret Sardis's past. In the last few years, one tool that we've come to rely on is drone photography, which offers countless new ways for us to explore the ancient city from above. At the top of Sardis's imposing Acropolis, for example, the remains of the medieval citadel walls cling precariously to the hillside. What you see here are bits of those remains. Earthquakes and erosion have gradually worn the walls away, leaving behind isolated towers and doors that lead nowhere. Originally, though, these fragments would have been part of a solid fortification designed to defend the Acropolis from attack, with bastions constructed almost entirely from reused blocks that were taken from abandoned buildings in the city below. The rugged cliffs make conventional survey methods impossible, so we've used the drone instead. By flying the drone around the ruins and photographing them from different angles, we're able to produce interactive 3D models like this one that we can use to study the otherwise inaccessible walls in great detail. The process has also allowed us to identify parts of the cliffs that have fallen away, to map out where now missing sections of the wall once stood, and to recognize areas that are in danger of falling in the future. Aerial photography has opened up a part of Sardis we previously could not reach, allowing us not only to study the walls, but also to take necessary steps to preserve them. Drone photography is also an important resource in our effort to reconstruct the city's monumental western gate. In 2014, we discovered these marble blocks lying on top of Sardis's main Roman road, right where it enters the city. They seem to be the ruins of a massive archway, the largest arched gateway that we know of from the Roman Empire, which was toppled by a massive earthquake in the 7th century CE. We're using a drone to document the enormous blocks, some of which are much bigger than a person and weigh several tons, and digitally fit them back together, part of our effort to understand what the arch looked like when it was standing. You can see how the modern roadway follows roughly the same course as the Roman road of 600 CE, which itself followed the line of the Lydian road of 600 BCE. This is a complex area where layers of history come together. Thanks to the drone, we can model the terrain and visualize how different ancient buildings fit together, and we're using those capabilities to digitally reconstruct the city with models like this one, showing Roman period Sardis. The aerial imagery helps us imagine the arch not just as a single monument, but as one of many interconnected puzzle pieces within ancient Sardis's vibrant urban landscape. Of course, it's not all sober and serious work. Drone imagery has become a tremendously valuable research tool for archaeologists, but it also offers us that rarest of opportunities to see a familiar place in an entirely new way. 60 years after our work began here, these videos are letting us rediscover Sardis' astounding beauty from the air. We're glad we can share it.
So that is, the reason I find that this interesting is because there is a connection between this history, this idea. Just imagine yourselves growing up in there. There's this fabulous, fantastic sort of ridge of mountains surrounding you almost completely with a wall, and you're looking down into that valley. Whoever came from the east, you would have seen. And whoever came from any other part, you basically didn't care much, because you would have had your sentinels up on the walls, on the different towers, seeing them from way ahead. And it was so steep that it was virtually impossible to climb up, and not for the town, for the city, to have been aware of what was going on and then defend themselves. So this creates, or created, seemingly most commentators would agree that it creates that's a different sense of who you are, what you are, and your safety and your security within this kind of natural enclosure that protected you. So bear that in mind, because we will come back to that with what actually did happen in history that the author is using to drive the message to Sardis. So he says in the second part of verse 1, I know your deeds. This is that phrase that we see in almost all messages introducing, and there is one single message that is delivered to the church in Sardis. And he says, you have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Looking back, recapping some of the other messages, there's no opposition. There's no persecution happening in here. There's no theological challenge. There's no Jezebel or Nicolaitans trying to twist the Christian message and oppose the church. There is no money problems. There is no problem with the gods of the guilds that we had in Pergamum. There is nothing going on that is worth mentioning or accusing or saying, poor you, you are under attack. In fact, there is this expression, you enjoy or you have a reputation. But I know, Jesus says, that your reputation is not what it seems. Because I am him that holds the seven spirits of God, that has the fullness of God, and I can see your heart. I can see your mind. You don't fool me. I can see what you really like. James, if we go to James chapter 2 and verse 17, says like this. He's referring to faith and deeds, this sort of argument that is still going on. Is faith enough, sufficient, or do we need to do things? Well, I think James puts it in context in the same way. He says, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by actions, is dead. So Could we think that these people had a good knowledge of their faith and yet weren't necessarily practicing it? It could be a way of looking at it. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 5 says, having a form, is accusing or talking about the godless days that are to come in the last days, and says, he talks about having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Talking about a faith that is going to be lived or interpreted or accepted as a type of faith, but that has no edge, that has lost its power to transform a person's life, or a faith that basically is a title. So Jesus says, I know where you're at. And this expression that is that first phrase in verse 2 says, wake up. And the idea here of this expression is not wake up from being sleeping. It is the wake up and become watchful. Open your eyes. You know, like when you're sitting and you're looking out into somewhere, your eyes are open, you're awake, you can see that you're awake, but you're not quite there. You know that moment? And then somebody talks to you and they need to talk to you again a little bit louder, and then you kind of react. It is that type of wake up. Open your eyes. Because the author, if you like, this is the call, open your eyes, and the call is, and it says, because lack of spiritual vigilance may actually be costly. Because Sardis was a church that pleased men. They had a reputation that was recognized, that the outsider, the onlooker would say, the other 6 churches in the area would have said, there's a reputation there. That church has a reputation, but it didn't fool God. There was, if you like, we could probably think about, there was contempt, there was mediocrity, and perhaps that really is why there is no opposition. Even the local authorities didn't see it worth persecuting this church because they are harmless. They are just there, but they are not doing much. They're not doing a lot of proclamation. They are not doing an awful lot of claiming big changes and allegiances to this Christ. They just had a faith. But outwardly, towards others, it seemed to be a reputation. But God had a different understanding of what he was seeing. And he says, strengthen what remains. And I love that. There was one of, it was the second song, I think, that Guadalupe chose, that is that figure, that moment of a fire. You know, you've had you're camping, if you like that sort of thing, you're camping. I've done it twice in my life, so I kind of remember. And you've got this fire, and the fire is kind of starting to go off, and you kind of get those embers just about, you know, there is a moment where that coal is beyond remission, beyond bringing back. You know, you're fanning away there with a piece of cardboard, with something, a plate, And then there is a moment where it does not matter how much you fan, that call will not come back. That's the moment that Sardis seems to be at. So the urgency of God's message and call is wake up, strengthen, fan what remains, because it's about to die. For I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God, is Jesus saying in the message. Your faith is not gone anywhere. It's unfinished. It's not producing fruit. Our first song was about that passage in John 15. And that vine that produces is meant to produce fruit. It is pruned in order to produce fruit. But what happens to the branches that don't produce fruit? They are pruned away. They are cut off because they did not finish what they were there for. It says, remember. And this remember, again, is not a recalling from the past, like in the church in Ephesus message, where they have lost the love that they had at first. No, it's not recalling. This remember means, is that expression in English that uses bear in mind, consider, reconsider what you have heard and obeyed. What you have received and heard, that the understanding here is what you have, you know the message. You don't need to be re-evangelized. You don't need to be told again about God's message. But you need to remember, what was it like, or return to the obedience of that message. And when you do that, hold it fast. And then there is this repent. And the repent that it is in here is an urgent call for obedience. This is emergency. This church is on emergency mode. Is on the red bit of the dial. Their tank is about to run out. So is that Sardis was a church that pleased the men but didn't fool God? Lack of spiritual vigilance may be costly. I like that expression. And this has got to do with the history of what's going on with Sardis. And I love this bit because I think it makes so much sense when you read a few sort of this commentators, and it makes so much sense, you know, when something is on a piece of paper and then you read it, but then when you know the background that could have happened and it was going on behind perhaps the author's hand, it's like a eureka moment. Sardis, as you remember, protected on three sides naturally with walls and steep mountains. They just had a sense of, we're okay. Nothing is going to happen. That just basically gives complacency because, you know, you feel protected. So Sardis was a city that was rich. It was known for being rich, for being a fortress, but twice in history that did not happen. And what is written in history is very, very interesting. And we're talking about Cyrus the Great. This is Cyrus that is going to eventually found the great Persian Empire. And some of the conquests that he did was actually to conquer the kingdom of Lydia. exactly what this area. And so Croesus was the famous king of Lydia, that is the last king of Lydia, and he was just resting on this protection and this false sense of security that nature had given him to his city that had never been conquered. And it says, or the story goes, that soldiers from the Lydian kingdom just posted up on the wall, were having a chat, and one leaned over just to see what was happening over the wall, and his helmet fell, and it got lodged between the cracks of this sort of steep wall and steep mountain where the wall was on. Unknown to them, soldiers from Cyrus's army had been inspecting the area to see whether there were ways to get in, and they were convinced that it was impossible to go into Sardis to conquer, until they heard what happened. And so they looked from their hiding place, and they saw that this soldier climbed out, as they were probably used to, climbed out the wall and sort of came down the wall to rescue and to take his helmet. And the soldiers realized that there was a way in. And it was actually, even though it looked unclimbable, it looked impossible to get over, they actually realized that there was a way in. And the history goes into that eventually the armies of Cyrus the Great came and conquered Sardis. And that happened again 300 years and a bit later by the Greeks, by Antiochus the Great. And this was the history that stood behind and in everybody's mind in Sardis. Because then the following verse is quite overwhelming. So the reason for this conquests was basically overconfidence and passiveness, because they felt protected. So in the second half of verse 3, then we read, we're not quite there yet. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. And there is an appeal almost to the historical memory, because the Sardians were actually suffering from a cultural seeming trait that they had in themselves, which was overconfidence and passiveness. And the church was expressing that same sense of no need to do anything else. We've heard the message, we've understood it, that's okay. We don't need to do anything about it. We just enjoy it. Just but create a reputation. Sardis as a city had a reputation of being unconquerable, and yet it fell twice in history. The Sardian church had a reputation, but God was not being fooled. Yet, like all our messages, there is a little something, because Jesus does not close the door completely. Yet, it says in verse 4, you have a few people, and this time is with a sense of sadness. I think that I take this phrase. There are a few people that understand the urgency. There are a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. And this expression probably needs understanding a little bit about what's going on in here. Soiled clothes in the presence of a deity would have been understood as dishonorable to the deity. When somebody came into a god's cult of some sort, even pagan cults, it would have been with their best clothes on. So the expression, again, just goes into what people would have understood in the day. A few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes, they will walk with me, dressed in white, for they are worthy. So this idea of being dressed in white is the idea of purity, perhaps the idea of festivity, perhaps even the idea of victory. You remember that in Revelations chapter 21, 22, we will see a crowd that were all dressed in white. When Jesus and the three disciples went to the Mount of Transfiguration, his clothing and the clothing of Moses and Elijah were white, were turned white. The angels that appear at the resurrection were wearing white, shining clothes. So we could think of that, but when we read then and go on to the next verse and go into the second part of verse 5, I will never blot out the name of the person from the book of life, it says. We probably need to think about white clothes as a sign of justification. And it is then Jesus who does that. They will walk with me is the presence of Jesus, is the walking with Jesus that dresses us in white and makes us worthy. The one who is victorious, like them, will be dressed in white. And it is I, Jesus says, that I will never blot out the name of the person from the book of life. But actually, it is I that will acknowledge that person's name before my Father and my angels. It is Jesus, the one that is presenting our case before the judge and before the court of the judge. In Luke chapter 12, we read something that tells us a little about this scene. It says, I tell you, so warnings and encouragements that Jesus says, I tell you, whoever acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge. But he who disowns me before men will be disowned before the angels. It is Jesus, the only solution to Sardis. It is the waking up, is the bearing in mind, is the becoming watchful, is the reversing of this attitude of sitting back because we're not going to be conquered, because we're protected, because we are unconquerable. So therefore I can sit back. No. Jesus says, become watchful, because the faith is lived in a watchful mood or mode. And that fire, like the song we sang, should never, can never go out, and is on us to maintain that fire going. So I just pray that as we have thought this morning about what's going on with these churches and today's message. It is possible for the church. It is possible for a believer to have heard the message and not be opposed, not ever face a theological problem, or never go through ups and downs of life, and yet just the normal ins and outs of life, the normal walking of life, just imperceptibly, if you like, cool down the fire that once roared with the Spirit. And we need to be watchful that that doesn't happen. On a personal level, yes, but as a church, there is hope that Jesus knows our hearts, that Jesus knows who's burning. But it is on us to make sure that that message, that fire continues to burn. There's nothing really else to say. It says, whoever has ears, you've heard the message. And I think it's to do with this historical background. You know the story. Jesus says to the Sardis, you know what happens. You've suffered these things in your own history. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. May this morning the message be encouraging more than anything else, that our hearts may burn again, and they let us do an effort of be watchful, of waking up, if you like, and continue fanning into life that fire that is in our hearts, that is called Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for this morning. Thank you that the warnings are there, because you don't want to be taken by surprise ever, and you don't want us to be taken by surprise ever. May our community here in Northwest Madrid, may we take this thing seriously and make an effort, not because it's going out, but because it needs to be maintained in good health, this fire that you've given us. Thank you for your word. Amen.